By mid-February 1943, the arid reaches of the Tunisian dorsal became the stage for one of the most sobering chapters in American military history. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, stood at the zenith of his tactical prowess, overseeing a battle-hardened Afrika Korps that had been tempered by years of high-intensity desert warfare. From his command post near the Tunisian border, Rommel observed the chaotic remnants of the United States II Corps with a mixture of professional detachment and burgeoning contempt. In a poignant and blunt correspondence to his wife, Lucy, Rommel articulated a sentiment that echoed throughout the German high command. The Americans were fundamentally soft. He noted that while their industrial might was evident in the sheer volume of their equipment, their soldiers lacked the visceral, soldierly spirit required to survive the pitiless reality of the modern battlefield. To Rommel, the Americans were not yet warriors. They were merely armed civilians led by officers whose amateurish blunders would have warranted a court-martial in any European army. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was not merely a defeat, it was a systemic collapse. Over the course of 6 harrowing days, American forces suffered more than 6,000 casualties. Entire battalions, overwhelmed by the rapid, synchronized thrusts of German armor, surrendered in the field. Massive quantities of state-of-the-art equipment tanks, half-tracks, and artillery were abandoned intact, left to be scavenged by the victorious Axis forces. For the American GI, the psychological impact was devastating. Rommel perceived this as a breaking point in the American national psyche. He believed he was witnessing a tactical disintegration that could be exploited to end American involvement in the war. In his assessment to Berlin, he argued that a secondary offensive, launched within weeks, could decisively push the Americans back into the sea before they possessed the opportunity to adapt or learn the bitter trade of war. The American failure at Kasserine Pass was not a matter of individual cowardice. Rather, it was a profound indictment of the U.S. Army's contemporary leadership and doctrine. As German intelligence officers compiled their post-battle reports, a clear and unflattering portrait of the American military machine emerged. The Americans, they concluded, were fighting a 1918-style war in a 1943 reality. The most glaring vulnerability lay at the pinnacle of command. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, the commander of II Corps, had become the embodiment of American military ineptitude. Operating from a fortified bunker complex, dubbed Speedy Valley, located a staggering 70 miles behind the front lines, Fredendall attempted to micromanage the battle via radio and telephone without ever setting foot on the actual terrain. His orders were often described by subordinates as confused, contradictory, and utterly detached from the tactical situation. He prioritized the construction of his own safety over the cohesion of his units, creating a vacuum of leadership that trickled down to the lowest ranks. Tactically, the American doctrine of static defense played directly into the hands of the German blitzkrieg. While the Germans practiced the Schwerpunkt, the concentration of superior armored force at a single, decisive point, the Americans dispersed their tanks in small, penny-packet formations. This allowed the German Mark IV and VI Tiger tanks to isolate and destroy American units piecemeal. Coordination between infantry and armor was virtually non-existent. When German panzers broke through the initial lines, American radio discipline dissolved into a cacophony of panicked, unencrypted chatter, further aiding German intelligence. German doctrine, refined since the invasion of Poland in 1939, focused on fluidity and aggressive exploitation. They relied on the fighting withdrawal and the counterattack as primary tools. In contrast, the Americans at Kasserine reacted with a cascading panic. When one unit retreated without orders, it triggered a domino effect across the entire sector. Rommel and his staff calculated that it would take the Americans at least a year to rectify these structural deficiencies. They viewed the American command structure as an amateur league, trying to play against professionals. The German consensus was clear. The Americans had the tools of war, but they lacked the soul of it. They were convinced that the psychological advantage gained at Kasserine was permanent. In their view, the American spirit had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. They did not realize, however, that the humiliation of the Tunisian desert was not the end of the American story, but the beginning of a radical, violent metamorphosis. On the 6th of March 1943, the malaise hanging over the American II Corps was shattered not by a German shell, but by the arrival of a single man, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. His entrance was a carefully choreographed exercise in psychological warfare directed at his own troops. Arriving in a motorcade with sirens blaring, flanked by armored scouts, and sporting his signature ivory-handled revolvers, Patton signaled a violent departure from the Speedy Valley era of his predecessor. He did not merely assume command. He conducted an exorcism of the defeatist spirit that had haunted the American ranks since Kasserine. Patton's immediate priority was the restoration of fundamental discipline, a concept he viewed as the bedrock of combat effectiveness. He instituted a regime of strict adherence to military regulations that, to the weary soldiers in the Tunisian heat, appeared almost tyrannical. Men were ordered to wear neckties, leggings, and regulation steel helmets, even in the rear echelons. Officers who arrived at briefings out of uniform were fined on the spot. Soldiers who failed to salute were publicly reprimanded. To Patton, these were not mere formalities. They were the outward signs of an inward grace. He aimed to transform a collection of defeated refugees back into a professional army. He understood a fundamental truth that Rommel had missed. The American soldier was not inherently soft, but he was currently undisciplined. By enforcing a standard of excellence in appearance and protocol, Patton forced his men to regain their self-respect. If they could master the small details of their uniform, they could master the complex machinery of modern war. Beyond the aesthetic, Patton executed a brutal leadership purge. He had no patience for the hesitation of the fearful. He relieved commanders who showed a penchant for defensive thinking and promoted those who displayed an instinct for the jugular. Under his watch, the IO Corps command structure was flattened and energized. He demanded that his officers lead from the front, observing the battlefield with their own eyes rather than through filtered radio reports. The German High Command, observing these changes through intelligence intercepts, remained largely unimpressed. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who had taken over operational duties as Rommel's health declined, calculated that while Patton might improve morale, he could not possibly rewrite an entire military doctrine in 3 weeks. German experience suggested that an army required months, if not years, to recover from a systemic collapse like Kasserine. This miscalculation, this belief that time was on the side of the Wehrmacht, would prove to be the most significant German intelligence failure of the Tunisian campaign. The dawn of the 23rd of March 1943 brought with it a cold, clear light over the rugged hills of El Getter. The German 10th Panzer Division, an elite formation equipped with the formidable Mark IV and Mark V tanks, advanced with the rhythmic confidence of a predator that had already tasted victory. Their objective was to shatter the American 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and roll up the American flank. The German plan was a carbon copy of their Kasserine success. Concentrate armor at a perceived weak point, trigger a panic, and exploit the ensuing retreat. However, the army they encountered was no longer the one they had mocked in February. As the lead elements of the 10th Panzer rolled toward the American lines, they were met by a mechanical symphony of violence that defied their expectations. The first shock came from the American artillery. Instead of the sporadic, ranging shots typical of amateur batteries, the Germans were struck by a time-on-target, 2 salvo. This was a sophisticated coordination technique, where every gun in the Corps fired at different times from different distances so that every shell landed on the same target at the exact same second. The result was a cataclysmic eruption that blanketed the German advance in fire and steel. This level of synchronization, facilitated by the American industrial gift for telecommunications and logistics, was something the Germans, still largely reliant on horse-drawn assets for their artillery, simply could not replicate. On the ground, the infantry of the Big Red One stood their ground with what German survivors later described as cold, professional rage. They had traded their fear for a newfound lethal competence. When German tanks attempted to bypass strongpoints, they were met not by retreating soldiers, but by mobile tank destroyers and anti-tank teams positioned in overlapping fields of fire. The Americans had abandoned the static waiting-to-be-hit posture of Kasserine in favor of an aggressive, active defense that turned the desert floor into a kill zone. By noon, the 10th Panzer Division had been halted in its tracks. The Italian Centauro Division, supporting the German flank, was decimated by the accuracy of American small arms and machine gun fire. General von Arnim, receiving the reports in his headquarters, was incredulous. The tactical reports described an enemy that was aggressive, coordinated, and utterly refusing to break under pressure. El Guetar was more than a tactical victory, it was a doctrinal revolution. In 21 days, Patton had not only restored discipline but had also integrated the arsenal of democracy's technological might into a coherent fighting system. The American soldier had found his rhythm. The The German sense of superiority, cultivated since 1939, began to evaporate. Rommel's earlier warning, once dismissed as the ramblings of a sick man, now echoed through the German ranks. The Americans had learned, they had adapted, and they were now the architects of the Axis's inevitable defeat. The American success at El Gueter was not merely the result of grit. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare that fused the United States' industrial capacity with a sophisticated tactical rhythm. While the German military prided itself on the individual brilliance of the Panzer commander, the Knights of the Desert, the Americans countered with a systematic, mechanical application of force that made individual heroism secondary to organizational precision. The cornerstone of this new doctrine was the time-on-target (TOT) artillery strike. By leveraging superior telecommunications and standardized firing tables, American batteries could achieve a feat of coordination that seemed supernatural to the receiving end. Hundreds of shells from disparate locations would scream through the air to converge on a single German platoon or tank column at the exact same second. For the German infantryman, it felt as though the very sky were collapsing. Furthermore, the Americans revolutionized their anti-tank doctrine. Moving away from the static, easily bypassed lines of Kasserine, Patton's corps adopted a mobile defense. They utilized M10 tank destroyers, lightly armored but heavily armed, to create lethal crossfires. They no longer tried to outduel German tanks in one-on-one matches. They used their superior numbers and radio coordination to lure the panzers into killing sacks where they were struck from the flanks. It was a cold, efficient, and industrial approach to slaughter that neutralized the technical superiority of the German Tiger and Panther tanks. By April 1943, the Desert Fox was a ghost of his former self, both physically and professionally. From his sickbed in Germany, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel watched as his earlier warnings were vindicated in the most tragic fashion for the Axis. His letters to the High Command had shifted 180 degrees from his February assessments. He no longer spoke of American softness. Instead, he warned that the Americans had shown themselves to be more advanced in their tactical thinking than the British. Rommel's successors in Tunisia, General von Arnim and his staff, were forced to confront a terrifying reality. The American II Corps had become a professional, aggressive, and unrelenting force. The psychological advantage gained at Kasserine had been utterly liquidated. Every attempt to launch a localized counterattack was met with a wall of American fire and immediate, violent counter-thrusts. The end came on the 13th of May, 1943. The Tunisgrad disaster saw over 250,000 Axis soldiers, among them the elite veterans of the Afrika Corps, march into captivity. It was a defeat on the scale of Stalingrad, and it signaled the permanent loss of the African continent for Hitler. The Americans, who had been humiliated at Kasserine just 3 months prior, were now the guards escorting the invincible Germans into prisoner-of-war camps. The 90 days between the shame of Kasserine Pass and the triumph in Tunisia changed the course of the 20th century. It was the pivotal moment when the arsenal of democracy found its sword. The transformation was so profound that it redefined the German understanding of their opponent. In post-war interrogations, German generals like Hasso von Manteuffel and Albert Kesselring expressed a begrudging, almost startled respect for the American evolution. Manteuffel noted that the Americans identified weaknesses and corrected them within weeks, not months. They had realized that the American soldier was not a tourist in the theater of war, but a rapid learner who possessed an uncanny ability to turn industrial might into tactical lethality. From the beaches of Sicily to the hedgerows of Normandy and the final push into the heart of the Reich, the lessons learned under Patton in the Tunisian desert remained the blueprint for victory. The Americans did not try to build a better knight than the German panzer commander. They built a better machine of war, one fueled by coordination, aggressive leadership, and overwhelming fire. By May 1943, the myth of German superiority had been buried in the sands of North Africa. The world now faced an American army that was professional, technologically dominant, and possessed of a professional rage that would not stop until it reached Berlin. The 3 weeks Patton spent fixing the I Corps had, in reality, fixed the trajectory of the entire war. Thanks for exploring today's story with us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to discover more fascinating historical stories with us. See you in the next episode, where strategy and intelligence continue to shape history.